Welcome back. So let's get started to create our first code to create our infrastructure. So this video will take you from beginning to end to create a basic AWS EC2 instance. I want to cover a lot of things that Terraform does in this video. So this video might be a little bit longer than some of the other videos, just because I want to touch base on a lot of different things to get a good so you can have a good overview of everything. And then in later videos, I will go over everything in more detail on everything that Terraform has to offer. So first thing is Terraform has its own language called Terraform Language, which is based on HCL. So what we'll do, the first thing we want to do is every Terraform has its own configuration file. So I just have a directory here, course, which is empty. So let's make a file. So you notice I'm going to name it main.tf. And most of the time, you'll have all your configuration files named main.tf. And the .tf is Terraform specific. You may end up having other files like variables and different things like that. But for the most part, you're always going to have a main.tf. And it could be named anything you want. It could just be foo.tf. Terraform will recognize it. But it's good practice to name your main configuration file main.tf. So one thing is I'm using VSCode. So if you're not very familiar with VSCode is just a nice editor to use for code. It's very popular for JavaScript and Python and everything like that. So that's what I am using here. And I have an extension installed for Terraform specifically. So I get syntax highlighting and different things like that. So you might not get syntax highlighting out of the box. So if you're in VS Code and you go to the extensions pane here, search for Terraform. And I already have it installed, but I will give a link to this in the description. But what you want to do is just install the Terraform. HashiCorp is what is the parent company of Terraform. So this is their specific extension, which is nice. So that's the most popular one. You can see almost 600,000 downloads. So just install that. That'll give you a lot of syntax highlighting and extra benefits. All right, let's go back to our code. Let's clear that out. All right, so we have a blank main.tf file. And these files.tf, the Terraform language, is just like any other language. It can be like a JavaScript or a Python or anything like that. It's just Terraform's specific language. And then it just compiles down to whatever they can read. All right, so what we want to do is we want to create a EC2 instance in AWS. So normally, if you want to create an instance in AWS, you might go to your, I'm assuming everybody is familiar with AWS and Azure and all of that. So you have a background in cloud computing and all of that. So that aside, so let's say we're going to go and create EC2 here. So we go to instances, and we need to, let's launch the instance here. So this works fine. So we're going in here. We just click it. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to do this by writing code. So the first thing is there are providers in Terraform, and what the provider is like a AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. Or it can be GitHub, it can be GitLab. There's a bunch of different providers that Terraform offers. The main ones that I use and that a lot of people use are just going to be AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. So that's what we're mainly going off of. And every provider has a bunch of different resources with it. So the AWS provider, has its own way to create EC2 instances. Whereas the Azure provider has its own way to create virtual machines as well. So let's take a look at the AWS provider, since that's what we're going to go through. If we look through this list, we have AWS. And there's some basic code for that. So you can see the provider here. Every one of your main.tf, so we have our main.tf file here, is always going to have a provider block. And you can have one provider block or you could have 5. It kind of depends on what you're doing, but for the most part, you'll have 1 or 2. Most of the time, just 1. It just kind of depends. And you can see our provider here, we have a provider block here. And then inside of that, inside of this string is AWS. So that provider, this AWS corresponds to, our AWS provider. If we were using a different provider like Azure, it's actually Azure RM would be the provider here. So you stick that right in between the strings here. And then you also have a version block. The version block is not required, but it's something you always kind of want to have, because else if you don't, your provider version could change as you go, and then your code might not work. So it's good to always specify that. And then for AWS specifically, you have a region. So as you know, like when you create an instance, you have, in the top right here, you have your different regions that you select from. So if I'm in US West, Oregon right now, so when I create this instance, I'm going to be in US West for Oregon. So for the provider here, we're specifying the region here, or this is specifying the region here of US East 1. And there are some other options that you can go into in the provider. Some of them are like authentication. So there's a few different ways you can actually authenticate. So when you actually need to create resources like a virtual machine, or in this case here a VPC, you need to be able to authenticate to your AWS account or your Azure account. So there's a few different ways you can do that. With AWS, the one that I use a lot, and definitely when I'm developing locally, is I use the AWS environment variables. So just like if you use the AWS CLI, which a lot of people are probably familiar with, it'll read from your AWS access key ID. Is there an example here? Yeah. So you can have it automatically read from, it'll automatically look for this if you want. So your access key ID and your access key secret, and that will validate you to be able to create resources inside of AWS. That's one I mainly use for local development and everything. There's also, you can provide it here in the provider here. This is not the best way to authenticate, because, you can see a warning here. Your credentials can get leaked. So for the most part, for now, just use the environment variables. Will be just fine. You can also set a default region if you want. And then there's also a shared credentials file as well. I'll let you all read up on the different ways to authenticate if you want. That's that. So the next thing we have, so you have the provider block in every configuration. So let's create a provider block here. Let's see. So provider AWS. So we're using AWS. So the AWS is the provider here. And then you have the curly braces. These are what provide the configuration inside of this provider. So what did we have? We had a version that we could do. And I think the current version is 2.65, if I'm not mistaken, for what I'm doing. So we're going to add the version. And then, let's do the region. So with AWS, you always need the region in there unless you hard code the environment variable for region. But we're going to let's do US West 2. So we'll do US West 2, and you can see the region here, US West 2. So it's going to be what's in this right side of the regions here. All right. So good. So that's our provider. So every configuration is always going to have a provider here. If we were using Azure, our provider would be Azure RM, which Azure RM means Azure Resource Manager. And then inside the curly braces, we would have our details like these. I'm going to go over Azure in one video, and I'm going to go over Azure and the configuration compared to AWS in a video in the future. So look for that. But for now, we're just going to do AWS. Yeah, but you could have, this provider here, and you could have Azure. You can have both of these providers in the same config. So maybe you want to create a virtual machine in Azure and an EC2 instance in AWS. You can do that just fine. So that's where it's nice to have Terraform. You can just do it all from one file versus if you were to use, CloudFormation or Azure Resource Manager, ARM, you would have to create 2 different configurations for all that, whereas Terraform, you just do it into one. But we're just going to keep it simple for this and just do one provider. All right, the next thing we have is resources. So every provider has a bunch of different resources. And these resources are like your virtual machines or your VPCs, your subnets, your security groups, and different things like that. So if you see in this example here, this has a VPC. So this VPC, this creates a virtual private network for AWS. And this is a resource that belongs to AWS. And resources are defined with the resource block here. So you have resource, and then the resource name, and then you have a name here. So you see this as an example. This name here can be anything you want. It can just be foobar. It's whatever you want to have it called in your file. The value here does not get uploaded to your cloud provider at all. It's only for Terraform's purposes for when it stores state. And I'll get into state a little bit later. But this can be anything. It just has to be unique. So if you have AWS VPC example, you can't have another. If you want to have another VPC resource block, you would have to name it like AWS VPC foobar or example 2. You can't name the same resource with the same name here. And there's literally hundreds of different resources depending on what provider you use. And to keep it simple, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a basic EC2 instance with AWS. In AWS, if you create the EC2 instance from Terraform, it automatically will attach to your default virtual private cloud and all that. So we're not going to create that. But let's just create a basic EC2. So most of the time when I'm working with Terraform, I Google this all the time. I just Google it. So like I need to create a EC2 instance. So what I usually do is I will Google Terraform AWS EC2. And most of the time what comes up is going to be the correct thing. So if you look, there's docs here. Let me just make sure I'm on the right one. All right, I'm on the right one. All right, so here's a resource. Every resource has a documentation in the Terraform docs that kind of goes over everything that the resource can do. So here again, you have your provider. Then you have this data thing which we haven't gone over yet. I'm not going to go over that yet, so ignore that for now. But then we have our resource here, our resource block. This is what we're looking for. So this is what we need to create our resource. So if you look at the description, you see provide an EC2 instance resource. This allows instances to be created, updated, and deleted. All right, so let's start creating that. But first, let's look at the arguments. So if you look at this page, there's arguments. So there's some that are required and some that are optional. So like when you go through the interface and you want to, create an instance, it's always going to ask you for like what you want to create and all the details of what you're creating. And the first thing you always have to select is you have to select the AMI. So it allows you to select that. So that's one of the required parameters of this resource, AMI. It's required, the AMI for the resource. So if you look here, it's specifying the AMI here. Another thing that's required, the instance type, I believe, is also required. If we go down, yeah, so we have instance type here. The instance type is the size of the instance. So do you want T2 micro, T2 large, M5 large? It kind of just depends on what you want. And these are what we have here. These are the very basics that we need to create this instance. So let's go into our code and do this. So if you look here, this is the resource name. This is a unique identifier for this. So when we want to create a AWS EC2 instance, this is what we need. So let's go into our code and let's create that resource. Then it's AWS. And if you notice the providers, the resource name is always going to be prefixed with the provider underscore. So we have AWS, then it's always going to be AWS underscore something. In our case, it's going to be instance. And then we just need a name here, and this is just for Terraform's purposes. So we can name this foobar if we want. And then we have a block, and then inside these curly braces are our configuration. So our first argument, or our first configuration, let's do our AMI. So you always have like the configuration, the argument here, which is AMI, and then it equals something. So what we need to do, we need to specify an AMI. So there's different ways you can do to get an AMI. So for this video, we're just going to do a very basic, and we're going to grab an AMI from our interface. So let's go back to here, and we're going to use Ubuntu. So if you look here, it has the AMI ID here, and this is what we're going to use. We're going to copy this. If you wanted to use Red Hat, you could copy this, or depending on what instance you have, you can determine what you want. We're going to do that. So then we're going to use double quotes here. So we need double quotes here to enclose that. Since this is technically a string, it needs to be enclosed in double quotes. If we had a different config option that was like an integer or number, we wouldn't need the double quotes. But since this is a string, it needs to have the double quotes. All right, so we have that. So we have our AMI. So now we need our instance type here. So let's do instance type. Again, this is going to be a string, and the instance type needs to be like the size of the instance. So let's just walk through the interface. So let's select here. And so we've selected our AMI on the previous screen. Now we need to specify like what type of instance do we want. So we can do a general, any of these. So, let's just say we wanted a T2 medium. So usually in the interface, you would just select it here and go next. Well, all we got to do here is do T2.medium. So we have it there. Perfect. So this is the bare minimum that we actually need to be able to create this instance. And this assumes that you already have a VPC set up, Virtual Private Cloud, through AWS. And what this will do is this will actually just attach to that VPC by default. But most of the time, you'll either create a VPC or you'll specify a VPC or a subnet in this, which we'll get into in a couple of videos. But for this, I want to be able to create this and kind of show you. So now this is all we need to create the instance. So another thing with Terraform is maybe we wanted to do a comment. So you can do a comment in a few different ways. You can do a comment like that if you needed to. Or let's just say like we had some notes. You can do a block comment like this, like in some other languages. So everything inside this, the / and asterisk, is a comment until you get to this last asterisk and /. So everything's a comment there. You can also do comments with a £sign here, so you can see all of this is commented out. Now, so that's kind of the basics on how you do comments in Terraform. All right. So we've got our configuration file set up, and we're ready to create our resource. So how do we do that? All right. So the way we're going to do that is through the Terraform CLI. So we have the Terraform command installed. So what we're going to do is we're going to we'll use the Terraform command to create our resource. So we have the Terraform command installed, and we can verify this by doing Terraform version. So good, we do have it installed. So we can pass different arguments to the Terraform command to do different things. And the first thing we want to do when we're creating new projects or resources is we run the Terraform init command. Terraform init. And what init does is it basically it'll look at like the provider blocks, and it will download the providers. So in this case, it's going to download the AWS provider, and it'll also do a few other things, like it'll download it'll download state if it needs to. You don't really need to worry about that now, but let's just do Terraform init. And you only have to do this once most of the time. So you just run the Terraform init one time, and then you won't have to do it again. All right, so now we have the AWS provider. Everything's initialized. So now we can actually start creating our resources. So let me clear this out. All right, so the main command that you're going to be using all the time is going to be Terraform plan, Terraform apply, and Terraform destroy. So let's run Terraform plan. All right. So what Terraform plan does is it basically just gives you a dry run of what is going to happen when you're going to create your resources. So plan doesn't actually do anything to AWS. So when you do plan, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to actually hit the cloud and do anything. All it does is just kind of give you an overview of what it's going to do. So you've written the code here, and you just got to kind of see what is it actually going to do. So you can come here and you can see, before you actually want to commit your changes to the cloud provider, you can see what it's going to do. So you can see here, it kind of looks like a code diff if you look at it. So you have an AMI, and then it tells you a bunch of stuff. So it's just saying we have a bunch of green pluses. So basically we're just creating a bunch of, or it's just every detail is a creation. So you don't see any minuses or anything like that, which you'll see in a little bit later. But you can see it's got T2 medium, and you've got a lot of things that say known after apply. So once it's not going to know these until it actually creates the instances of the resources. So Terraform plan is nice, to just run and kind of see what are your changes expected to do. And you can see here it says plan 1 to add, 0 to change, 0 to destroy. So here all we're doing is adding one resource here. All right. So if you do plan and everything looks good, so we're ready to actually create it. So the way to actually create it is Terraform apply. So let's run that. All right. So when you notice Terraform apply, you kind of have the same output from plan. So what Terraform apply actually does is it runs a plan first. So it runs Terraform plan first. So before it does the apply, it does the plan, and then it asks you, are you sure you want to perform these actions? And you can either say yes or no. So we're just going to verify again. Everything looks good, so we're going to do yes. So before we click yes, if we look, I don't have any instances created here. So there's nothing here at all. But I'm going to hit enter yes. And as long as we filled out everything correctly, this is now going to start creating our instance, our resource, which is an AWS instance, into the cloud. So this, depending on how many resources you're creating, this could take a couple of minutes. It could take 20 seconds. It could take 5 minutes. It just kind of depends on how much you're creating. All right, so now it's created. So you can see apply complete. Resources 1 added, 0 changed, and 0 destroyed. So it added 1 resource, which is our instance. So if we come back and we refresh, we should see an instance. And we do. We have our instance here. And it's still initializing. But this is the instance we created. So that's pretty cool. So you can see it's a T2 medium. We did T2 medium. And it created it from our AMI here. And it's in US West 2. So Oregon is US West 2. So perfect. So we have our instance created. So that's pretty cool. So let's go back here. So now if we look at our directory structure, if you look actually here, you see it added a couple files automatically when we did that apply. Or the init, when we did Terraform init, it created the .terraform directory. But when we actually did Terraform apply, it created this terraform.tf state file. And you don't need to really worry about this. You can kind of ignore this file completely. But the way Terraform works is it stores state. So Terraform needs a way to know like what's created, what wasn't created, and different things like that. So like if we change this to T2 micro, Terraform needs to know that that's going from a micro to, or going from a T2 medium to a T2 micro. So one way it's able to do that is by storing everything that it has done in this state file. So that's what Terraform uses internally to store state. So you don't really need to worry about this too much right now, but that's kind of how you might hear me talking about state a lot. And that's what this Terraform state is because that's how it knows what it needs to actually do when you do an apply or a plan or a destroy, which we'll get to right now. So perfect. So now we've got our instance created. So we're kind of done with this. Like we've created our instance. We know what providers are now. We know what resources are. So now we're done. We're done with it. We just kind of like we've tried it out. We've tested it. So let's remove this instance. So a lot of times, instead of going to the interface and like clicking instance state terminate, since this is all, so that state is now under control of Terraform. So if we wanted to, we could delete this in the interface here and it would work just fine. But since we have this under Terraform control, what we can do is we can run Terraform destroy. And what that will do is that will just get rid of that instance completely. And what you'll see here is you'll see it doesn't do it automatically. You have to do Terraform destroy, and then it's going to prompt you to make sure that you actually want to destroy the resources. So you can see here it's all minus signs where before it was all plus signs. So this is basically just going to destroy everything that we have in this file. It's going to destroy it. And if you had other instances, so like if I manually created a new instance here and like the name was foobar, or I had 10 other instances here, when you do destroy, it's not going to destroy those. So don't worry about that. I know when I was first starting, I got a little nervous. I'm like, I'm creating this stuff and I'm going to do a destroy. And I'm like, is that going to delete everything in my AWS account? And it's like, no, it won't. Terraform knows to do that based on the state file. So it's only going to do things that are tracked through Terraform. So it's not going to, you don't have to worry about it touching any of your AWS resources. But here we can verify that it's going to be removing everything. And we can click yes and we're good to go. And this sometimes could take a minute. It could take, a few seconds. It kind of just depends on how many resources you have. All right. Now after, 30 seconds, 31 seconds, it's destroyed. So now if we look and we go back here, you see it says running. If we refresh the page, it should say like terminating or terminated. So now this is terminated. So now that instance does not exist anymore in our system. So it's gone. Perfect. So now we've created a provider AWS, we've created a resource. We've gone over, our Terraform language syntax and all of that. We've gone over creating files. We've downloaded the correct VSCode extensions to get the Terraform syntax. And we've destroyed our resources as well with Terraform destroy. So that's the basics and the starting point of a lot of things. And that's kind of all we're going to go over today. In the next video, we're going to go over updating the infrastructure. So maybe we wanted to, we're going to change this from a T2 micro, or we had it at a T2 medium. So maybe we want to put it at a large. We'll show you how to do that. It's very simple, but there's just some things you want to look out for when you do it. So we'll go over that. So make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you don't miss out on the next video. And I will see you in the next video.